Well, Space Raiders is, let's say, a spiritual successor to Space Invaders. It was developed, of course, by Taito, and I believe it was only released on the Nintendo GameCube. As you can see from the mode selection here, the game is fairly arcade style. It's something you're meant to replay over and over.
You leave me no choice.
Space Raiders is an arcadey shooter. The perspective works just like Galaga, the original Space Invaders, any of those games you care to think about. And the controls are fairly simple. You move left and right and you shoot as things come at you. That's about it, right? That's how the original Space Invaders worked. Well, luckily this isn't the original Space Invaders, and there's more than one element to its design. Let's start with the difficulty, which was actually the only piece of design in the original Space Invaders. The original Space Invaders had an increasing difficulty curve due to a programming error, where enemies would move faster and faster. In Space Raiders, however, the increasing difficulty does not come from faster enemies, but rather different enemies. Enemies that attack differently and move in different patterns and shoot different bullets. The combination of each enemy approaching you differently makes things a lot harder, considering you're stuck at the bottom of the screen. You have to avoid their bullets and pay close attention to how they move at the same time, which adds for quite a bit of challenge. Now, the fact that there are more enemies in this game that shoot in different ways and move differently means of course there are going to be more dangers flying your direction, and to deal with this you have a roll move. The roll has to be used preemptively. You're supposed to predict how the creatures will move and then roll accordingly before they strike. All of these enemies are introduced slowly throughout the stage. They show the player this is how this enemy works, this is how you predict and dodge it, and by the end of the stage they add all the enemies together and it gets really crazy. But so far we've just been doing a whole lot of talking about evasion, where that's only half of the equation. There's this whole ecosystem of attack and defense evolved in Space Raiders. For starters, there's the way your bullets interact with enemy shots. Sometimes your shots completely destroy enemy bullets, and sometimes they just split the enemy's bullets in two, actually making things much more challenging. There are also many other factors in play in how the enemies move and attack. There are stage-specific obstacles, like you see these aliens surfing in here on cars trying to run me over, and there are some enemies that are mother enemies that give birth to smaller enemies. This system of constantly introducing new enemies, new attack patterns, new obstacles, new hazards, slowly as the player progresses until it builds into something absolutely insane, is really, really fun to play. The enemies' specific gimmicks also function alongside the stage's theme. For example, this stage's theme, the downtown area, is clearly plant life, and the enemies' shots and the enemies' gimmicks reflect that. There are enemies that regrow themselves, there are enemies that shoot seeds that spawn other enemies, and all the attack patterns work in a way that sort of look like a whole bunch of crazy-ass plant life trying to kill you. The whole idea of theming gameplay mechanics around the stage's themes continues for the whole game. For example, in the sewer, the idea is to make the player think things are a lot simpler than they are. Enemies can deceptively appear out of absolutely nowhere. Some goo monsters you shoot can actually turn into smaller goo monsters, and you actually fight a clone of yourself at one point. So it's very clear that the stages and enemies work together to form this kind of offensive ecosystem towards you, but where does the player fit into this ecosystem? Well, the player is just as much a part of it as everything else. Because, you know, you're the one dodging the bullets, you're the one avoiding the enemies, paying attention to how they move, but there are also some small strategies involved that make the game a lot more fair. Sometimes enemies can drop power-ups, or power-ups can be gotten from destructible items in the environment. These power-ups are fairly simple. They do things like make the player move faster, make their shots wider, make the shots move faster, or even slow time a tiny bit. But the thing is, when used in conjunction with already the crazy everything else that's going on, it makes the game a lot more involved and hectic. It adds that much more that you need to pay attention to, and it changes the ecosystem around. You are the biggest influence on the game's ecosystem. I could go on and on and on and on and on about tiny details that make the game more involving, that add all these little nuances to the game design and make it really worthwhile and enjoyable, and all this junk, but I think you have the idea of how the game works and what makes it special. It's a game where the nuances make the game. It's very simple, but there are so many little parts to the simplicity that it ends up being a whole lot more than the sum of its parts. Or rather, it benefits from being the sum of its parts. Either way, the biggest overall expression of the game's design is the boss fights. The bosses all actually have a whole ton of creative attacks that never really step over into bullet hell territory, but are very difficult to dodge and work with the character's overall design. The character being the boss, of course. Basically, instead of the bullets and attacks existing separately from the boss's personality, the bullets and attacks are actually a consequence of the boss's personality. It just comes off as really satisfying because it feels like I'm being attacked and am attacking an actual creature that works with the design of the rest of the creatures in the stage I've seen so far. Now, don't get me wrong, Space Raiders is definitely not the only game to do this ever, but it does it really, really well. The characters' bullet patterns, like, they match their personality. I'm not sure how else to put that, and it's really, really interesting. I like it. So, the game, yeah, it's a remake of Space Invaders, but with actual game design. What is there not to like here?